Thank you for joining Striving for Perfection. This is the video channel the YouTube channel where we discuss all things theological, bibliologically, philosophically, logically, whatever your questions are. I hope to have some answers for you. And that is T.L. Robinson playing in the background for you. Please check out his channel and subscribe. He's got some really, really good music. Again, that is T.L. Robinson, and check him out. And as always, please subscribe, please comment, please tell others about the channel, and tell me what you would like me to cover. All right, let me cut that down, and let's get in today's topic. Of course, we are covering giving, and we have looked at tithing, we've looked at seed sowing, we've looked at free grace giving, and now we're on what I call loose ends. And in loose ends, we're going to look at three things: preacher pay, pressed down, and widows who gave it all. Now, we've looked at preacher pay, we've looked at pressed down last time, and now we're on widows who gave it all. All right, so this whole concept of the widow with the two mites or the two coins, what do we do with this? Because normally it is taught that we should be like her. So there are three questions we want to answer. First one is the widow a role model for Christians when it comes to giving? The second one is, was Jesus highlighting her for her giving? And the third one is, what should we take from her situation? All right, let's look at the passage in Luke chapter 21, verses 1 through 4. And let's see what all of this top talk is about the widow and what you hear in church. And so verse 1 says, and he looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the treasury. Notice that they're the rich that are putting their gifts into the treasury. And he saw a poor widow putting in 2 small copper coins. And he said, truly I say to you, this poor widow put in more than all of them. And I think that's where the whole thing comes from. She put in more. All right, she put in more than the rich people did because she put in all. All right, and they put in according to their surplus. We see that in verse 4, for they all out of their surplus put into the offering. So they gave out of their surplus. This is probably the tithes, okay, and we discussed that. And so they are doing what they're supposed to do, but Jesus is pointing out that she's putting in more. And he says, but she out of her poverty put in all. So they put out of their surplus and she put in all. Now here's the problem, because most preachers, when they teach this, in order to raise an offering, they stop at the words put in all and start screaming at a congregation, she put in all, as if to say, you see, she put in all. And Jesus is pointing her out. Think about this. She put in everything she had. This poor widow, she put in all of it. And they stop there, but they don't want to give you the rest of the words, that she had to live on. That means that once she put that money in there, she had nothing else to live on. And so the teaching goes, she is a role model. We should follow her example. If you're giving something out of your surplus, you haven't done anything. You're not doing what's right. But the question is, where did she get money to live on in the first place? Because I think if we answer that question, it will help us as we go through and try to understand everything else. So what we do is we go to the Old Testament, because while Jesus was on the earth, the Israelites were still under the law. He was fulfilling the law, but at this point, they're still under the law. And so when we go back to Deuteronomy chapter 14, 28 through 29, if you were in our tithing series, then you've seen this. But there were 3 different tithes, and the third tithe is the one that we call the benevolent tithe. So at the end of every 3rd year, you shall bring out all the tithe of your produce in that year, and you shall deposit it in your town. Now, I know it says produce. By the time Jesus had come along, they were really giving produce and money as well. Verse 29, the Levite, because he has no portion or inheritance among you, so you had to give to the Levite to take care of that. and the alien. The alien there would be the stranger, the person that's coming to the land that is not an Israelite. This would have been a Gentile. The orphan and the widow who are in your town shall come and eat and be satisfied, in order that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hand which you do. So you do have a benevolence. We could call it Social Security if you wanted to. The orphan and the widow and the stranger, they get what? They get every third year, this tithe would be brought out. Now, before you get to the point where you say, well, what happened the other 2 years? I mean, wouldn't that leave them destitute? Not at all. The definition of a widow biblically was a woman who was past the age of being able to remarry, would not have been able to generate income on her own, and has no kids, because it would have been the responsibility of the kids to take care of their mother. All right, Israel had a very tight family structure, and the kids would have taken care of their aging parents. So this is a woman who has no husband for any income, has no kids to take care of her, and so she is pretty much destitute. And some people try to teach that the life of the widow was a hard one. It wasn't supposed to be, not at all, because of this. So imagine how many women in, say, a town of 5,000. If you had 50 of these women, I would be surprised. You probably didn't have that many. How many orphans would you have? I mean, that meant both of their parents would have to be dead. A single parent household was not normal like it is today. Not at all, not even close, unless one of the parents had died. Otherwise, you had both parents in the house, and you wouldn't have an orphan. And if you had any, it was very few. And how many strangers, Gentiles, wanted to come into Israel? Israel didn't like Gentiles, so you wouldn't have that many. So every third year would have been plenty to last them until the next third year came up. So that wouldn't have been an issue. So then the question is, and notice also that they brought all that tithe. So say 5,000 people or 5,000 families or whatever the case may be is bringing in tithes for these groups. They would have had plenty. So how was a widow to be treated in Israel? Well, Exodus 22:21 through 24. You shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall not afflict any widow or orphan. So there's our widow. You can't afflict them. You can't treat them bad. They have to be taken care of. Verse 23, if you afflict him at all, that means if they're living in poverty, that's an affliction. And if he does cry out to me, I will surely hear his cry, and my anger will be kindled, and I will kill you. Now, let me just help you to understand. God says, I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless. Now, notice he says, your wives will become widows, and your children fatherless. So who is he talking to here when he says, you shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him, for you shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him? Who is the you here? See, that is the question. The you is whoever has responsibility for ensuring that these people are taken care of. I want you to notice again in verse 23, we have this thing here. It says, if you afflict him at all, and if he does cry out to me. All right. So if they cry out, then God is going to come down with a vengeance on what's going on. Keep that in mind as we go forward. So let's go back to our scripture. Now that we understand where she would have gotten anything to live on, it would have been from that tithe. And so when we get to that point, here we go. First of all, we know that she gave, right? They gave out of their surplus. And that most teachers are going to stop right here at she gave it all and try to convince you that you're supposed to give it all or something close to it. We know where she got the money to live on. All right. So it came from the tithes, but I'm still kind of confused as to why she's poor. I mean, so what we need to do is examine the context. And if we go back to the end of chapter 20, I think we'll get an idea of what's going on. So in Luke chapter 20, verses 45 through 47, let me set the stage for you. Jesus has had a run-in with the scribes who are trying to trick him. And here it is particularly the group probably from the Pharisees, from the Sadducees, not the Pharisees. The Sadducees didn't believe in a resurrection, so they have been questioning him on the resurrection. Jesus brilliantly answers their question, sends them away, And there are those around that have watched the encounter. So you get to verse 45, and while all the people were listening, he said to his disciples, and one of the things that you might take note of with Jesus is he usually doesn't talk to the people. He's actually talking to those that are his own disciples. Everyone else gets to hear. Verse 46, look at what he says. He says, beware of the scribes. Now, he just had a run-in with them, and he just says, beware the scribes. If you read the Gospels, you will find Jesus couldn't stand the scribes. He had run-ins with them all the time. They were constantly talking to him about tradition. He was constantly knocking tradition down. Paul said the same thing about him in his writings. They just were not to be trusted. But who in the world were the scribes? Well, first of all, the scribes had a noble beginning. When the children of Israel came out of the Babylonian captivity, I believe the prophet Nehemiah, I think, and I don't quote me on that. You go back and read it, and I may be wrong. It could have been Ezra, but he designated a certain group of Levites to begin to copy what we would call the Old Testament or the law. Okay, to copy the writings that they had up to that point. And they were meticulous in what they did. They did a very good job. In fact, what they would do is they would actually count the number of letters in the original documents that they were going to copy, and then they would count the number of letters in their copies. And if the number of letters in their copies didn't match up with the number of letters in the original document, they would burn the copy they made and start all over. So they did a wonderful job, a great thing. And so they had a lot of the law then available for the synagogues and for all of the teachers that were going to be teaching. Because they copied so much and because they did all of this and they were Levites, they became the teachers and the interpreters of the law. So when you went to the synagogue, the one that you were calling rabbi was a scribe. So they began to be the teachers. The key here is the interpreters of the law, because they began to interpret what they were copying, and they came up with all of these oral traditions. Now, let me explain to you what an oral tradition is real quickly. An oral tradition is where they make an interpretation and it gets passed down orally as to what something means. It's not something that is written. They just kept it orally and they passed it down. And of course, as with, you see this today, they didn't always agree on interpretations of what the law said. And so you had different camps of oral traditions that went back to certain individuals. And it was these oral traditions that Jesus was railing against whenever he went and they tried to confront him. They would always talk about the traditions of the fathers, and that's where they were coming from. And he would have to basically say, you got to go by the law and what the law says, not by your oral traditions. By the time Jesus showed up, the other problem was that the people had converted their language over into Aramaic. And so they didn't read Hebrew. And a lot of people don't know this, but yeah, they couldn't read Hebrew for the most part. So they were dependent upon the scribes who could still read Hebrew and were copying to tell them what it said. And so the scribes could tell them anything and teach them anything. So they were considered lawyers. They were scriptural lawyers, and they were called the doctors of the law. And some of you are sitting there right now and you're going, boy, this is starting to sound a little bit like some of the modern day preachers I know. And they get called doc, and yeah. So you're in the right place if that's what you're thinking. And because of this, because of the oral traditions, a lot of those oral traditions were finding what they considered to be loopholes in the law that would allow people to do whatever they wanted to do. In fact, by the time Jesus showed up, the law really had no real meaning other than to control society. The scribes controlled people through a religious base of the law in Judaism, but did not believe in it themselves. In fact, if you're a careful reader of the Gospels, they knew exactly who Jesus was. The religious leaders did. They knew that he was the Messiah. They knew that he was fulfilling things, but their concern was not that there was a spiritual awakening about to take place. Not at all. They were more concerned with a political concept of the Messiah coming in and taking over Israel. So you had scribes who, for lack of a better way of saying this, they weren't saved at all. They knew the word. because they copied it and they studied it. And when they got to the age of 30, they would be put into these positions of power where they could now stand up before the people and teach them and tell them whatever they wanted to do. And because they were the lawyers, certain things came along with that: authority, power. They had it. So I want you to notice here that in verse 46, when he says, beware the scribes, he says, who like to walk around in long robes. Long robes would have been, in other words, they were dressed up and they like to walk around. Walk around where? In public, so people could see them. It's starting to sound like mob bosses, putting on the beautiful suit. I'm going to walk around and people see me, and love respectful greetings in the marketplace. Kiss my hand, bow before me, make me known, honor me. And why the marketplace? Because that's where everybody hung out. So they walk through and people be like, oh, there goes so and so, this, that, and the other. And how are you today, sir? All that kind of just crazy stuff. Kind of like we do preachers. Anyway, and chief seats in the synagogue. So when people went to learn the law, it was the scribes that got the chief seats, the seats that would be up in front of everybody so they could be seen. Sound a lot like church, doesn't it? And places of honor at banquets. So, someone else's banquet honoring, I don't know, a wedding, honoring whatever the case may be. And here they come, and you got to give them a special seat because they are a scribe. But verse 47 is the key: who devour widows' houses. First thing you might want to wonder is, how in the world are they devouring widows' houses? They were the lawyers. That means that they had control of the money. So when that third year tithe came out, it was up to them to dispense to the widow, and they would be the ones to determine who was a real widow, who wasn't a real widow. By the time Jesus showed up, they had total control of all of this. It always went to the scribes. The scribes were handling the affairs of the widows. And so now they would teach the widows. Keep that in mind. They would be teaching the widows. All right. And it says they devour the widows' houses. Literally devour, they were eating it up. And how were they eating it up? They're the lawyers. They're the one teaching the widows. But wait a minute. If you mistreat a widow, then God's going to kill you, right? Well, remember that I said that they could come up with a loophole. The loophole was, if they cried out, what if you taught the widow that everything that she received, that if she wasn't thankful for, the Lord would cut it off? So whatever she got, just as long as she was alive, she had to be thankful for it. And on top of that, as we're going to see, evidently they taught the widow something really crazy. So they devour widows' houses, and for appearance sake offer long prayers. Notice appearance's sake. This is why I say these people weren't saved. They could have cared less about God. They cared about their lot in life and what they were doing. Appearance's sake. This made them look pious. Just like the preacher who talks to you and in regular conversation says, God is a good God and we should worship him. But when they get up in front of a congregation, all of a sudden God becomes God. They got two syllables for everything. And, God is a good God. And all the time, I'm sorry. You can call me whatever. I have been preaching for going on 20 plus years. And I'm telling you, that's a bunch of crap. Straight off the bat. It's for appearance sake. It is to move the crowd. That is what that is talking about. Long prayers. You ever been to an altar prayer and it lasts 10, 15 minutes for what? Okay, it's not necessary, not in that setting. I'm not saying you can't pray long. You pray as long as you want to. But in public, get to it, get with it, and move on. As an individual, that's where my longest prayer should come from. Anyway, get off of that soapbox. These will receive greater condemnation. Well, we saw that under the law, what we're told is that, they would be killed. But if they're teaching them not to cry out to the Lord about what's going on with them, but to be thankful, then they've escaped that. Well, Jesus says, no, they haven't escaped anything. They're gonna get their greater condemnation. You say, well, they're going to hell. How much greater could it be? Well, that's for another discussion at another time. Revelation chapter 20, when we look at the lake of fire and the different levels, they're going deep into it. So why was she poor? Well, we know because the scribes were thieves. They were attention whoremongers. They wanted attention and they were thieves. How do you think they got the nice robes? They stole. Why do you think Jesus, when he walked in, when it talked about him running out the money changers and all of that, who do you think they were? Those were the scribes. That's who he was running out. All right. So let's go back to our questions and let's see if we can answer this. Is the widow a role model for Christians when it comes to giving? Not even close. She is not an example of anything at all that is positive. She is an example of something terrible and something negative. And anyone that teaches otherwise is twisting scripture terribly. Was Jesus highlighting her for her giving? Not even close. He was using her as an example after saying, beware the scribes. And he specifically said they go in and they devour widows' households. And by the way, there's one right there. Look at what's going on. Now, I want you to understand in his example, the first thing he said was, there are the rich, they are paying, they're giving out of their what? They're giving out of their surplus. Were they supposed to? Absolutely. According to what? According to the law. Who taught them that? The scribes. So the scribes taught them the law, but they're the rich. Remember, the rich have power. Anytime you have money, you got power. So the scribes couldn't control them per se. The scribes had power, but they knew that their power over the rich was, well, let me teach this and kind of teach it right to them. Help them to understand that, yes, you have a surplus. In fact, it was the scribes that came up with the whole concept of, if you follow the law, then you would be rich. So they looked at the rich and said, we're going to get a lot of your money and we're going to do it by you just doing what you're supposed to do. But then when it came to this widow, here's the funny thing about tithes when you look in the Old Testament. The Levites who received tithes, received the tithes of the people. The Levites were told that they had to then themselves tithe on the tithe that they received. So the tithes they received was their income and they had to tithe on those tithes. But the widow, the orphan, and the stranger were not required to tithe at all. In fact, they weren't supposed to give because that was, like we'd say, a welfare check. It's what took care of them. And so because that was for them, because they were in a place and a condition that they needed taken care of, then it would be kind of stupid if you stop and just think about it for half a second, that they would receive something that is for their welfare and then have to give out of that, because God had blessed the land and the people with everything they needed so that they could eat and be filled, completely satisfied. And then they had all this other, and that part of that would be a benevolence for these people who didn't have land, who didn't have any income, who could not prosper or from all of that. But God ensured that they too were taken care of. And so the concept is that they shouldn't have been poor, impoverished, and yet she gave it all. She wasn't supposed to be giving anything, but what she had, she's giving back and giving all. So while the scribes are keeping her in poverty, they're also teaching her to give up everything. This is not an example that we're supposed to give everything at all. He was just pointing out the corruption of it all. So what should we take from her situation? So how do we apply this? Because that's always really the most important thing. If you get the context right, how do I apply it? Beware of the modern day scribes. And we got plenty of them. Plenty of them. They're on TV. They're on TV. Cut them on Sunday morning. Go to Daystar, go to TVN, you'll find plenty of them. Cut on Christian radio, you'll find them. It's a religious leader who preys on the powerless for gain. And let me tell you who the powerless really are. All right. The powerless are not necessarily the poor, although the poor are the ones that they love to prey on. But they go after the rich too. So how do the rich become powerless? It's simple. If you're an individual that goes to church and you look at that teacher, that preacher, that pastor, bishop, whatever he's called, Dr. So-and-so, Reverend, whoever, when you look at them and you say, whatever they tell me the Bible says, I am totally going with what they say, that means you have given up all of your power, all of it. You become powerless. They are in control. They are now telling you what to do. So if they tell you to give it all, you give it all. They are in total control. And they have become the modern day scribe because a lot of them want to be that way. The Bible calls them false teachers, and it says that they do it for sordid gain. Sordid gain, that's what that is. So what you have to do in order to not fall into that is you got to open your Bible and you got to study. Just like I just showed you here, you got to be able to do that. If you can't do that, then you become powerless, and then you are left up to the modern day scribe. Don't let people in my position go through and devour your house. Don't put yourself in the position of the widow. That's the whole point. So this, if you hear somebody else teaching on this and they're going through and they're trying to tell you, you know, you got to give it all, you got to give it up, whatever, and be like the widow, you should stand up and scream at them and say, nah, that's not what Jesus is talking about. All right, that's the lesson on the widow. I did get another question about, you know, people that charge for going to events like, you know, conferences, you know, those conferences that they have and all the things that go along with that. And they charge and people pay and they make money and do all of that. Is that right or wrong? I'm going to throw one of those videos out at you. Won't be too long here shortly. Then we're going on. I got to cover, I've had a question on divorce, and then I had another question on hell. So we've got some things, and they'll be coming as quick as I can put them out. All right. Please hit that subscribe button and subscribe. And hey, don't be afraid to forward the videos. You know, send them a link. Tell people to take a look at them. And give me your questions, comments. Look forward to all of that. Have a good whatever time of the day, morning, evening, or night it is. And continue to open your Bibles and study. Again, I'm Kevin Harris. This is Striving for Perfection. That music that you hear, that is my man, Terrence Robinson. Check him out.